What happens when the quest for scientific knowledge meets the fight for indigenous sovereignty? In the world of genetic research, this is not just a theoretical question. I'm your host, Ramsey Nasser, and today we are talking about scientific integrity and indigenous justice in genetic research. Welcome to Sustainability Matters by Gruyter Brill. For indigenous communities worldwide, the history of scientific research is often a story of extraction. Blood samples taken, data used without consent, and identities reduced to genetic markers, while cultural and political understandings of belonging are pushed aside. And yet, genetic research also holds genuine promise for addressing health disparities and advancing precision medicine. So how do we navigate this tension? How can scientists and indigenous communities collaborate in ways that respect different ways of knowing without demanding that one side surrender its integrity to the other? Well, to help us answer all of those questions and so much more, we are delighted to be joined today by none other than Dr. Benjamin Gregg. Dr. Gregg is author of Scientific Integrity and Indigenous Justice in Genetic Research, which is a chapter in the book he has authored called Indigeneity as Social Construct and Political Tool, Critique and Reconstruction of a Contested Identity, which has just been published by de Gruyter Brill. Dr. Gregg, welcome to the program.
Thank you very much. Delighted to be here.
I'm so happy to have you with us, and this is such an important topic. I wanted to slowly ease into it. This is a chapter in a larger book. We're focusing on the chapter here. So I wanted to start there with the bigger picture of the book itself. Why did you write this book?
Well, about 10 years ago, I spent a semester in Vienna as a Fulbright scholar, and several European universities invited me to give guest lectures. And one of them was the University of Deusto in Bilbao, Spain. And after the talk, my colleagues there asked me to submit a paper for the university's Human Rights Journal. And that invitation planted a seed. After all, I'm in Spain, the country that 500 years ago launched the European colonization of the Americas, destroying local economies, exploiting indigenous labor, plundering natural resources, ravaging political and cultural communities by forcing indigenous peoples to convert to Christianity, in what some historians describe as genocide. Thinking about human rights in that context, I found myself asking, well, what about the rights of the communities that European colonialism decimated? What do human rights look like for them? And that question led me to the tension at the core of my book, the tension between two commitments that pull against one another. On the one side, you have the idea of universal human rights, the idea that certain rights belong to every human being everywhere equally. But on the other side, you have the notion of specifically indigenous rights, including rights that protect cultural autonomy and self-determination. And these sometimes require carving out exceptions to those universal norms. In other words, protecting a community's right to govern itself by its own customs and values may sometimes mean allowing things that human rights would otherwise prohibit. And that raises hard questions about equality and cultural pluralism and the limits of supposedly universal ethics. But before I could even get to those questions, I confronted a more fundamental one. Which communities are actually indigenous, and what makes them indigenous? Researching that question, I discovered something really surprising. The term indigeneity has no accepted definition. The concept of indigeneity is really quite recent. It emerged in its current form over the last 40 years. It's always been indeterminate in meaning, even among all the world's many communities that describe themselves as indigenous. This indeterminate quality has real consequence. It means that very different kinds of groups and very different histories can claim indigeneity, and they do. Tribes in northeastern Brazil who have previously been assimilated into mainstream society, or communities in Africa and Asia that wouldn't qualify under definitions that require either European colonization or in some sense being first in some historical sense. And then there are groups like the Roma, once called the Gypsies, who don't have a homeland, not even an imagined one, and yet can still make a credible claim to indigenous identity. So I was intrigued by a pattern. Many communities describe themselves as indigenous, and yet the way one community understands and uses that identity can look almost nothing like the way another does. Clearly, indigeneity is not a biological category, and it's not tied to any single history or tradition or region. So what is it? That's the question that drove me to write this book. My argument is that indigeneity is best understood as a fundamentally political category, a form of identity that is oriented towards some political goal, and as such, it is a social construct that is an invention of the human mind, like all culture. But far from making it less meaningful or less legitimate, this constructed quality is precisely what gives it political power. Think about the Navajo Nation placing a moratorium on genetic research until proper governance frameworks could be established. They weren't appealing to biology. They weren't pointing to a blood test or a percentage on a printout. They were wielding their identity as a sovereign political community to force a renegotiation of the terms on which outsiders could access their people and their data. That is indigeneity functioning as a political tool, and it worked. When indigenous communities claim indigeneity, they are not simply describing who they are deploying an identity as a political tool to contest dispossession, to assert rights, to secure resources, to build alliances, to shape their own futures on their own terms.
Fantastic. I mean, what a great question. That really is a fantastic place to start. And so could you walk us through how you structure the book to respond to that bigger question? How do you break it down step by step through the book itself?
Sure. Well, let's begin with that fundamental question. What does it mean to be indigenous? We're not talking about a small corner of the world here. The World Bank estimates over 476 million indigenous people alive today. They represent 5,000 distinct cultures. They speak more than 4,000 of the world's 7,000 languages. They manage roughly a quarter of the world's land surface. And this is land that contains 80% of the planet's biodiversity. And yet, despite all of that, there is no single agreed upon definition of what indigenous actually means, not legally, not politically, and not among indigenous communities themselves. I argue that indigeneity is not a fixed biological fact. It's not a neat legal box. It's a social construct and also a political tool. And far from being a weakness, this ambiguity in the meaning of indigeneity is a source, can be a source of political power. And my book attempts to show how. Let me show you how going through the structure of the book, because its architecture itself tells a kind of story. I begin with the content itself and then expand outward to law, to technology, to history, to climate, and finally to the planet as a whole. Part one is about deriving agency from the very idea of indigeneity. This is the theoretical foundation for the book. For example, I developed the idea in one chapter of an indigenous rights state as a political framework for how indigenous groups might navigate the tension between nation-state sovereignty and international norms. I address a different kind of power in a chapter on self-isolating indigenous communities in Latin America, communities that have deliberately cut themselves off from outside contact. Consider what happened during COVID-19. Some of these communities had spent generations deliberately refusing contact with the outside world, not out of ignorance, but as an act of political will, as a way of protecting their culture, their governance, their identity on their own terms. Then a pandemic arrives that moves through populations regardless of borders or intentions. And for them, the question was, do you accept outside medical intervention and risk opening a door that you have kept closed for a reason? Or do you refuse in the name of the sovereignty you have fought to preserve and accept the consequences for the health of your people's survival? There's no clean answer here. And that tension between the right to self-determination and the obligations that come with being embedded in a larger world, that is what this part of the book is about. In the second part, I look at the 21st century and beyond and ask how might indigenous peoples best relate to genetic science, to artificial intelligence, and also to global corporations. With regard to the science and technology of human genetics, in the past, genomic research was done to indigenous communities rather than with them. And I propose restructuring that relationship so that indigenous peoples control the terms, own the data, and share the benefits of genetic research on indigenous people. With regard to artificial intelligence, I argue that indigenous epistemologies, in other words, the ways indigenous communities understand knowledge and the world, should not be accommodated by AI developers simply as an afterthought, if at all. Rather, indigenous communities should actually shape how AI ethics and governance are designed when it deals with them. And with regard to corporations and private capital, rather than simply indicting the corporate world as a colonial force, which it has often been, I ask a provocative question. How might corporations be reimagined as vehicles for indigenous empowerment? Part 3 then moves to intellectual history, specifically to the Western canon of political philosophy, and looks at two major thinkers, usually seen as part of the problem. The 16th century Spanish theologian Francisco de Vitoria, who justified Spanish colonialism in terms of Catholic natural law, and yet who also defended the humanity of the indigenous against the brutal conquistadores. And I look at the Swiss philosopher Jean-Jacques Rousseau, whose concept of l'homme sauvage, which is French for the natural man, has long been criticized for reducing indigenous peoples to a romantic projection of European anxieties. I should note, by the way, that Rousseau also develops a moral perspective that finally includes indigenous peoples. I argue that both of these thinkers, very influential, contain buried inside their contradictions ideas that can actually be repurposed for indigenous agency. And I perform a kind of intellectual jujitsu. I use European colonizers' own intellectual tradition to advance decolonial ends. Part 4 then turns to the climate of our planet. And here I join, I think, one of the most urgent conversations of our time. I argue that addressing the climate crisis requires a real partnership between scientific methods and indigenous knowledge systems, not as a feel-good gesture, but as a practical necessity. I push back against a romantic cliche. I do not present indigenous communities as inherently or automatically conservationists. Some are pragmatic actors navigating economic pressures, survival needs, and political constraints, just like everyone else. What some of them bring is something distinctive: deep, place-based ecological knowledge accumulated over generations, which I argue can be combined with a growing ability to deploy satellite data, AI, blockchain, and remote sensing to protect their lands. I argue that these two ways of knowing, scientific and indigenous, are not inherently incompatible. They can, in fact, complement one another. Part 5 then, so to speak, pulls the camera back to the global stage. And my final two chapters argue that indigeneity isn't just a local or even a national concern. It can be a transnational political force operating in an international climate, or in fact being a kind of international climate diplomacy in legal fora and in cultural movements. In my last chapter, I issue a challenge to the nation states. Recognize indigenous laws and governance frameworks not as some kind of gracious concession, but as foundational to planetary survival. Consider a single statistic that I find remarkable. Indigenous peoples manage roughly a quarter of the world's land surface, and that quarter contains 80% of the planet's remaining biodiversity. These two numbers together are not a coincidence. They are a governance outcome. They reflect thousands of years of legal traditions, land relationships, and resource management practices that kept ecosystems intact, while extractive economies were destroying them everywhere else. When I say that indigenous governments' frameworks are foundational to planetary survival, I am not issuing a romantic salute to tradition. I'm pointing at an empirical track record that nation states with their property regimes and their growth imperatives cannot match. The challenge to nation states is therefore not a charitable justice toward marginalized groups. It is an argument about what actually works. Indigenous sovereignty, I argue, is not a special interest. It's a template for ecological and political justice. What ties all these chapters together? That indigeneity is not about preserving the past. It's about reclaiming a future where political sovereignty and ecological stewardship are inseparable. Hence, the fight for indigenous rights is a fight that concerns all of humankind.
Fantastic, fantastic. That's a beautiful flyover of the whole book and really helps position this conversation specifically on Indigenous justice in genetic research in that bigger context. That's really useful. But before we get into the chapter specifically, I did want to clear one small thing out of the way. While most of our audience is academic or academic adjacent, for the benefit of some of our audience members more deeply embedded in the general public, I thought it would be useful to define a term that you use frequently in the book and in this chapter, and that term is epistemology. So I would say that epistemology, roughly speaking, is about systems of knowledge. Is that a fair description of the word, or have I oversimplified it?
No, you're correct. Let me nuance that a bit. The notion of epistemology does a lot of work in my book, and therefore it's worthwhile to discuss it. Epistemology is the study and a theory of how we know what we know. And it asks what counts as knowledge, what counts as evidence. How do we justify truth claims? Who gets to decide what counts as legitimate knowledge? And it matters because I'm comparing two distinct ways of producing and validating knowledge: modern scientific epistemology and indigenous knowledge systems, of which there are many. Modern science operates with a fairly specific set of assumptions. It seeks knowledge that is empirical, testable, and reproducible. Scientific claims need to be falsifiable. Ideally, they generate explanations that hold true for everyone, everywhere, at all times. Now, contrast that with how indigenous knowledge systems work. They tend to be place-based, relational, and culturally embedded. Here, knowledge is often transmitted through lived experience, through storytelling, and through community practice. Rather than aiming for universal laws, these systems focus on what works within a particular ecological, cultural, and historical context. I claim that these two ways of knowing are not simply two versions of the same thing. They are structured differently. They pursue different goals. Science isolates variables. It generates generalizable explanations. Indigenous knowledge takes a holistic approach. It connects environmental, social, and spiritual dimensions of life. That difference creates a tension in current debates. Some scholars respond by dismissing indigenous knowledge as superstition. I think that's scientific imperialism. Other scholars go to the opposite extreme and say all knowledge systems are equally valid for all purposes. And that, I think, is radical epistemological relativism. So here's where I come down. I argue for a middle path, what I call epistemological pluralism. Different knowledge systems can coexist and they can collaborate, but they shouldn't be forced into a single hybrid framework. When we try to merge them completely, we distort both. Instead, I propose a division of labor. Science contributes empirical data and causal explanation. Indigenous knowledge contributes cultural context, ethical guidance, community trust, and long-standing environmental insight. Those are different strengths. When they work alongside one another, you get better outcomes, even as we acknowledge that different communities operate with genuinely different assumptions about what exists, what matters, and how truth gets established.
Beautiful. So let's get into it, shall we? This chapter covers a lot of ground. Focusing on this chapter now with that fantastic contextual background. Well, you can tell me, is it fair to say that the central argument of this chapter is similar to what you just said? You're speaking against some kind of fusion between science and indigenous epistemologies, and for collaboration between them instead. You call them, as you just did, a plural epistemology. Would you say that that is really the heart of the matter in this chapter?
Exactly. And that distinction is where the whole argument hinges. So let me try to make it concrete. In my distinction between fusion and collaboration is the heart of the chapter. The temptation when people talk about honoring indigenous knowledge alongside natural science is to imagine blending them, creating some unified hybrid system where both traditions flow together into one. Now, I understand the appeal. It sounds inclusive, even generous, but it's actually a mistake in both directions, and here's why. If you force empirical science to accommodate claims that are by design non-falsifiable, claims rooted in spirituality and mythology or in sacred tradition, you're asking science to abandon the very thing that makes it reliable. And if you take indigenous knowledge systems and squeeze them into frameworks of natural science, demanding they be objective, universal, and measurable, you're doing violence to those traditions. So instead of fusion, I propose what I call plural epistemology. The idea is that different knowledge systems can work alongside one another without pretending that they are the same thing. And that means a division of labor. Science does what science does best. It generates empirical data, causal explanations, and findings that can be replicated and applied broadly. Indigenous knowledge does what it does best. It provides cultural context, community trust, ethical grounding, and a holistic understanding of how people can live and experience the world. These are different strengths, but they can serve the same larger political project. The goal is not to collapse them into one another, but to let them collaborate while preserving the integrity of each. A concrete example is a Maori cardiovascular study in New Zealand, where researchers used traditional Maori methods of relationship building and communal storytelling alongside standard genetic and epidemiological analysis. The science remained rigorous, the community engagement was genuine, neither compromised the other. That, to me, is what plural epistemology looks like in practice.
Fantastic. And in the chapter, you arrive at a point in the chapter where you give two lists that kind of just juxtapose against one another. The first is of good practices in that regard. You call them ethical science, which I assume demonstrates a kind of plural or parallel epistemological approach, as you're discussing here, and a list of bad practices, which you refer to as exploitive science. I wanted to ask you if you could elaborate a little bit on these two opposing approaches, and if you could give us some examples of each of them in practice.
Sure. Let me start with exploitative science, because understanding what went wrong is the only way to understand what needs to change. Science is exploitative when researchers treat indigenous communities as a resource to be mined rather than as people to be served. The historical pattern is consistent. Researchers arrive, collect biological samples, blood, tissue, genetic data, often under vague or misleading pretenses, and then leave. The data gets published, careers get advanced, companies develop products, yet the indigenous community that made all of this possible gets nothing. Consider the history here. From the 1790s onward, colonial science collected indigenous biological materials without consent, not to help those communities, but to classify and rank them, to build the pseudo-scientific case that indigenous peoples were biologically inferior and destined for extinction. Those patterns have continued into the genomic era. There are documented cases of genetic samples collected for one purpose being used for entirely different research that communities never agreed to. And in some instances, governments and corporations have used genetic findings to attack indigenous land claims. So when indigenous communities today are skeptical of researchers showing up with cheek swabs, that skepticism is not paranoia. It's a rational, historically grounded response to a well-documented pattern. So let me try to distill what makes science exploitative into a few specific patterns. Science becomes exploitative when researchers obtain consent deceptively or skip it altogether. When researchers take the data and give nothing back to the community that provided it. When research ignores or undermines indigenous sovereignty. When findings challenge indigenous identities or land claims. When indigenous experience and ethics are excluded, when research serves external rather than community-defined agendas, and when researchers use the data later in ways communities never agreed to. Now, ethical science flips every one of these dynamics. I use three questions to distinguish them. Whose knowledge? whose benefit and whose control. In ethical science, research is co-designed with the community, which is not just consulted, but which genuinely co-leads. Indigenous government structures have authority over what gets studied, how data is stored, and what it can be used for. This is called indigenous data sovereignty, where consent is ongoing, not just a one-time signature on a form, where findings are shared back with communities in their own languages in ways that are actually useful to them, and where the benefits, health programs, treatment options, and research capacity flow to the people whose participation made the research possible. Returning to that Maori cardiovascular study for a moment, researchers integrated traditional Maori practices of relationship building and communal dialogue alongside standard genetic and epidemiological methods. They didn't just extract data and publish it. They built trust over time. They returned findings to the participants, and people who were identified as being at risk received free clinical referrals. The science was rigorous. The community was served.
Amazing. Yeah, that's very clear. You spoke at the beginning of our conversation about your trip to Spain. I don't know if you know, I'm based in Spain. I live in Madrid. And one of my good friends is an expert in Spanish medieval literature. She was telling me of a play that she saw last weekend about the traditional ballads that have been preserved through oral traditions in rural Spanish villages, with some of the poems going as far back as the 15th century. I think they call it the romancero tradition, it's called. So this play that she saw was a reenactment of the true story of the rediscovery of these medieval poems by philologists in the 1800s and 1900s. And so all these academics just started appearing in all these rural Spanish villages, and they were treating them like they were living archives where they could still hear and access medieval Spain. But the way that they went about their research sounds so much like what you're describing, this description of extractive science. The researchers would record the poems, publish them, and then leave. So the communities didn't get anything out of the bargain. They just gave away their secrets, so to speak. They weren't really treated as partners in the production of knowledge. And so, of course, over time, this inevitably led to resistance from rural villagers to collaborating with any arriving academic asking about anything. They accused them famously of having ruined everything. And as a result, a lot of these medieval poems ended up going undocumented and before they were lost. So anyway, that's anecdotes neither here nor there, but it's just to illustrate that, I think that those examples you gave really resonate with me. Okay, so we're really starting to get into it now. Let's talk about indigenous mistrusts of scientific research. I gave you that example there of those villagers in Spain in the 1800s and 1900s. But in the chapter, you give a few other illustrative examples that really, I think, viscerally show why that indigenous mistrust of scientific research generally is well-founded. Could you share some of those with our audience?
Sure. This mistrust is not a problem to be overcome through better public relations or clearer consent forms. It's a rational, politically sophisticated response to a long and documented history of harm. And when you understand that history, you understand why mistrust is an appropriate response. Let me walk through a few layers of that history because it goes deeper than many people realize. It starts in the colonial era. Scientists were collecting indigenous samples, not to help those communities, not even out of neutral scientific curiosity, but to classify, rank, and ultimately justify colonial domination. Early race science used skull measurements and biological hierarchies to construct a pseudoscientific case that indigenous peoples were inferior and primitive, indeed, and destined for extinction. Now, these weren't fringe views. They shaped government policy and public opinion for generations. And while the scientific community by now has thoroughly discredited that work, the pattern it established, treating indigenous bodies as objects of inquiry rather than as people with rights, didn't simply disappear with the bad science. When you move into the modern genomic era, the pattern repeats in some ways. There are documented cases of researchers arriving in indigenous communities, collecting genetic samples under vague or incomplete descriptions of what the research was actually for, and then using that data in ways that communities never agreed to. In some instances, genetic findings have been deployed not to help communities, but to challenge land claims, essentially using science as a legal weapon against the very people whose DNA made that research possible. Consider some examples. I mentioned the Navajo Nation that placed a moratorium on genetic research, a full stop until proper governance frameworks could be established. That's not anti-science. That's a sovereign community saying, we have been burned before, and we will not participate again until there are binding agreements about who controls this data and what it can be used for. That's a coherent and defensible position. So when we talk about indigenous mistrust of scientific research, we're not talking about a cultural misunderstanding or some kind of communication problem. We're talking about exploitative science. And if we're serious about collaboration, we have to start with that history.
Bravo. Yes. I mean, it sounds fair enough that indigenous communities should be a bit skeptical of scientific research, given all of that. You also highlight indigenous mistrust of genetic research specifically within the realm of broader skepticism towards science and scientists, genetic research specifically. And you also give some illustrative examples that I find really make the case. They make it so much more vivid. Could you share some of those stories with our audience?
The pattern begins, as I said, in the 18th century with colonial scientists collecting indigenous remains for racial classification without consent. Now, fast forward to the genomic era, and the pattern repeats. A striking case involves the Havasupai tribe in Arizona. Members of that community donated blood samples in the 1990s for research they understood to be about diabetes, a genuine and serious health concern for their community. They later found out that researchers had used their DNA for studies the community never agreed to, research on schizophrenia, on ancient migration patterns, on questions of population origin that challenged their own sacred oral histories about where their people came from. And that brings me to one of the most insidious dynamics today, the use of genetic findings to undermine indigenous land claims. There have been documented cases where genetic data has been mobilized, sometimes by governments, sometimes by corporations with interests in disputed land, to argue that a community's biological makeup doesn't match the community's claimed ancestry closely enough, or that their ancestors weren't really from a given territory in the way they assert. You can see immediately why this is threatening. Genetic research arrives promising health benefits, and then the data gets repurposed as a weapon in a legal or political dispute over land and sovereignty. The community had no say in that second use. The consent they gave covered nothing of the sort. Then there's the more recent phenomenon of consumer genetic testing, 23andMe, Ancestry DNA, and their competitors. These platforms allow anyone to take a cheek swab, get results showing some percentage of, say, Native American ancestry, and then in some cases to use that to claim indigenous identity. What gets bypassed entirely is the actual community, its governance, its cultural obligations, its own criteria for belonging. Indigenous identity, as many communities understand it, is rooted in relationships, in lived participation, in reciprocal responsibilities to the community and to the land. It is not a percentage on a printout. But these genetic platforms essentially transfer the power to define indigenous identity from the communities themselves to corporations and to individual consumers. That's not a neutral technological development. It continues an old pattern of outsiders deciding who indigenous people are.
That resonates a lot with me. I want to give you a personal story about that. I'll tell you that story in a little bit. What you're talking about here, this kind of political identity, ties in with what you were talking about in the introduction and the setup. We were giving the framework for your book. And it sounds like there's a clash now that you're describing between genetic identity and political identity. Is that fair? Is that a fair description?
Yes, yes. And let me start with the genetic identity side because that's the one most people encounter first. The idea is simple. You are what your DNA says you are. Your ancestry is in your genome. And with the rise of consumer testing, I mentioned 23andMe, there are other companies, this idea has become extraordinarily accessible. You spit into a tube, you get a result back saying you are 3% or 12% or 27% of some ancestry. And for many people, that feels like a revelation, an objective fact about themselves delivered by science. The problem when it comes to indigenous identity is that this framing is not neutral. It has a history, and the history is ugly. The most direct ancestor of genetic identity as applied to indigenous peoples is something called blood quantum, proportion of blood. A blood quantum is a system the US federal government invented in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. The goal was to determine who legally qualified as a tribal member. The goal was to define indigenous identity as a biological fraction and then watch that fraction dilute across generations through intermarriage. And to watch until ultimately the population legally defines itself out of existence. It was a colonial policy dressed up as bureaucratic administration. It was designed to shrink the number of people who could make legal claims to land, treaty rights, and tribal resources. Let's fast forward to today, and the same logic reappears in a different form. Someone takes a genetic test, sees a result, and uses it to claim indigenous identity without community membership, without cultural participations, without any of the relationships and obligations that indigenous communities themselves regard as the actual substance of belonging. The indigenous scholar Kim Tallbear calls this path to claiming identity the commodification of indigeneity. That is, corporations are turning indigenous identity into a kind of product that they sell. A corporation and its algorithm now decide who is indigenous, not the community itself. And the community, the one that actually carries the culture, the language, the land relationships, the governance structures, the community has no say in the matter. Now, political identity, as I use the term, is a counter to all of this. It says that indigenous identity is not a biological fact. It is a political and cultural status that communities define for themselves. It emerges from kinship, from lived participation in community life, from fulfilling reciprocal obligations to people and to the land, and from being recognized by the community as a member. Political identity is not a soft or sentimental claim. It has some elite international institutional backing. The United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples explicitly affirms that indigenous communities have the right to determine their own membership criteria. That's a sovereignty claim that matters. The argument is not that genetics is irrelevant to indigenous communities. There's genuinely valuable medical research to be done, identifying genetic susceptibilities to certain diseases, understanding how ancestry shapes health outcomes, developing precision medicine for specific populations. Now, all of that can be done ethically and beneficially. I distinguish between genetic research about indigenous health, which can be a tremendous good, and genetic research that purports to define indigenous identity, which is a colonial imposition no matter how scientifically it is framed. The authority to define a community culturally belongs to the community itself, and insisting on that is not anti-science.
Yes. Yes, I love it. I mean, everything, it's so funny how everything you're saying is resonating with me so much. You know, I was born in Canada to Palestinian parents, and I identify as Palestinian among many other things. And yeah, it's all of this is really resonating. I'm embarrassed that I seem to bring up Palestine in every episode, but in so many of these conversations, I really see the parallels. You know, genetic testing is illegal in Israel. The Palestinian author, the academic, Stephen Salaita, he has this very famous poem where he says, a Palestinian would never destroy a healthy olive tree. And he says, that this reality clarifies all of the complexities of reporting on what happens there. Who is, quote, he says, who is indigenous, Jews or Palestinians? A Palestinian would never destroy a healthy olive tree. Who is the aggressor? A Palestinian would, and he goes on and on. And it's a very powerful poem. The funny thing about my case, listening to you talk about political identity specifically, is that as I was raised in Canada, I never learned Arabic, as is the case for many Palestinians who grew up in the diaspora. And yet I find that I am fully welcome in Palestinian communities everywhere, regardless of any linguistic gap between me and the members of those communities. I think my membership card is a shared expression of a shared common political identity, which unites us beyond linguistic or cultural or other variables. I can also tell you, you may or may not be aware, I think this Stephen Salaita poem is kind of an indication of that a little bit, that there is a strand of thinking among Palestinians to self-identify specifically as indigenous to the land. And that over the years, especially the past 20 years, a lot of bonds have been formed between Palestinian activists and indigenous activists in North America, Australia, and elsewhere. But the point, I suppose the central point to form this into a question is that Palestinianness feels very much like an example of what you were describing as a political and not a genetic identity. But I mean, that's my takeaway from listening to you speak. It's like that Woody Allen movie where he's arguing with his girlfriend in the line for popcorn at the movie about what the director really meant. And so Woody Allen writes in to have the director actually show up and then provide the answer. So, well, I have you right here. You can tell me, is this idea of Palestinianness an illustration of your theory, or do you think it wouldn't apply?
What you're describing about your own experience cuts right to the heart of what I mean by political identity. You grew up in Canada, you don't speak Arabic, and yet you walk into Palestinian communities and you belong. Not because of a genetic test, not because someone measured your ancestry or assigned you a percentage. You belong because of a shared set of commitments to a history, to a struggle, to a future, to one another. That is identity constituted by relationship, by obligation, by mutual recognition. And that is precisely what I argue is the more authentic and more defensible basis for collective identity, certainly for Indigenous peoples, but as you point out, not only for Indigenous peoples. Your example suggests the principle is hardly confined to the Indigenous communities I discuss. The contrast with genetic identity is sharp and instructive. Imagine the alternative, a framework that said Palestinian identity is valid only insofar as it can be confirmed by a DNA test showing sufficient genetic continuity with ancient populations of the Levant. You can immediately see how that logic would be weaponized, and in fact has been in various forms in that very context. The claim that one group has a deeper or more legitimate biological connection to a piece of land than another is exactly the kind of argument made available by what I call genetic reductionism, the assumption that genetic ancestry somehow determines identity and belonging. It is an argument that tends to serve power rather than justice. You find a parallel with Indigenous communities in my chapter. Blood quantum laws in the United States didn't emerge because Indigenous communities thought biology was the right way to define belonging. They were imposed from outside by a colonial government precisely because defining identity genetically was a way to shrink populations, reduce legal obligations, and ultimately dissolve claims to land and sovereignty. The logic you are resisting when you describe Palestinian identity as political is, in its structure, the same logic I'm critiquing when I analyze what blood quantum laws did to Native American communities. The solidarity you mentioned between Palestinian communities and Indigenous communities globally makes a lot of sense through this lens. These are groups that recognize in each other a shared experience of having their identity defined, questioned, or delegitimized by outside forces with interests in the outcome. of having their relationship to land treated as something that requires external validation, of being told that who they are is a question for scientists, governments, or courts to settle rather than for themselves. And the political response to that is to assert that identity is not a biological fact to be verified. It is a political status to be argued for, to be claimed, to be exercised, to be defended. I want to stress here that my chapter focuses on Indigenous identity in the context of genetic research and data sovereignty, whereas the Palestinian situation has its own distinct legal, historical, and political dimensions that I wouldn't want to flatten into a single framework. But the underlying principle that belonging is constituted by commitment, participation, and mutual recognition rather than by DNA, yes, that applies to your experience of being fully welcomed despite the language gap because of a shared heritage and orientation and commitments. It illustrates what political identity looks like when it's lived rather than merely theorized.
Yeah, I love that. I love that. So we really are aligned on that. At the same time, it's funny a little bit what I just said before about being embraced as a fellow Palestinian by other Palestinians, despite not speaking Arabic, the language of the country. Because as the Arab world emerged from under Ottoman rule, beginning around, I think, the 1850s, an idea was born, or I don't know if it was born, but it certainly took hold at that time. And that idea still remains among many people in the Arab world, and especially the Levant today. And that idea is that belonging to the Arab nation, speaking now of Arabs, not necessarily specifically Palestinians, but the idea was that belonging to the Arab nation only required someone to speak the Arabic language. And this idea comes up again and again, and it's often juxtaposed against a European nation state idea based on the Westphalian systems, and the confrontation between those two models really comes up. I don't know if you read Margaret Macmillan, her book Paris 1919, about the Paris Peace Conference, and other people who have fictionalized and also written about the conference. They speak about the debates at that time and the clash between these two, the Westphalian nation-state model and the Arab linguistic nation model, comes up again and again, particularly at that time. And I couldn't help but think of that when reading your chapter and reading you talk about the importance and the right of Indigenous communities to self-definition. Can you reflect a little bit about on this? Can you talk about a little bit more about that idea of self-definition? And I wonder what you think about applying that concept much more broadly beyond just the Indigenous.
That's exactly the right question to push on. And my answer is, the philosophical case is broad, but the legal and historical weight is specific. Let me take the historical thread you've offered and then work my way back to my own argument. The Arab nationalist idea you're describing, that belonging to the Arab nation requires only that you speak Arabic, is one of the most radical and one of the most generous conceptions of collective identity in modern history. It was associated with thinkers in the early 20th century who incidentally drew on German Romantic nationalism idea that a shared language constitutes a people. The remarkable thing about this view is how deliberately it rejects ethnic or biological criteria. You don't need to be of a certain ancestry. You don't need to practice a certain religion. You speak the language, you share the culture, you belong. In a region that has been held together for centuries under Ottoman imperial administration, and then between 1918 and 1922 was carved into territories by France and Britain, this was a powerful and unifying idea. Note the contrast, as you do, with the Westphalian model. This model is the European conception. It begins in 1648, a conception of the nation-state. The nation-state is built around fixed territory with defined boundaries. Sovereignty means control over a bounded geographic space. This model becomes salient at precisely the moment you mentioned, the Paris Peace Conference of 1919. Woodrow Wilson's principle of national self-determination, which many in the Arab world initially found hopeful, turned out to mean something much closer to the Westphalian model: fixed territories, recognized governments, and borders drawn by the victorious powers. The Arab vision of a cultural linguistic community spanning a vast region without the imposed grid of European-style state boundaries was not on the table, at least not for the great powers. They partitioned the Ottoman Empire's Arab territories into British and French spheres of influence. They transferred control from the Ottoman Empire to themselves. France received mandates for Syria and Lebanon in 1920, and Britain for Palestine and Mesopotamia, what we call Iraq today. The consequence of this fragmentation have reverberated ever since. Now, what does all this connect? How does all this connect to what I argue in the chapter? It illuminates the principle and its complications. My claim is that Indigenous communities have the right to define their own membership criteria, and that rests on a specific foundation: that identity is constituted by lived participation, reciprocal obligation, cultural commitment, and mutual recognition, rather than by biology. And I think that foundation applies broadly. When I look at the Arab linguistic nationalist idea, or at your own experience of being welcomed as Palestinian through shared political commitments rather than language or bloodline, I see the same underlying logic at work. What makes a community is not what you can measure in the laboratory or trace on a map. It is a network of relationships, responsibilities, and shared orientations that people actually live. But caution is always warranted in such complicated discussions. In my chapter, the right of self-definition for Indigenous communities carries a specific weight that is connected to specific histories. For example, the history of colonial powers imposing definitions of identity on Indigenous communities in order to dispossess them. The right to self-definition isn't just a philosophical preference. It is a protective principle with legal standing, rooted, as I said earlier, in the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, and designed to prevent the repetition of a documented pattern of harm. The principle has force because of history. Does the same principle apply to all human groups? The general philosophical case is broadly defensible, that communities should define themselves rather than be defined by outside powers. What varies case to case is the legal architecture around it, the specific historical injuries that gave the right its urgency, and the practical stakes in any given context. For Indigenous communities in the genomic research context, the stakes include land rights, treaty rights, and the threat of biological redefinition by corporations or by states. For Arab nationalism in 1919, the stakes were territorial sovereignty and whether an imperial conference in Paris would honor or override instead the self-understanding of millions of people who had been promised something rather different. And the common thread in this: whenever an outside power claims the authority to define who a community is, whether through skull measurements, blood, quantum laws, genetic databases, or the stroke of a pen drawing borders, that is a political act. It is not a scientific act. And some of the communities being defined have a moral and perhaps even a legal claim to say that is not your determination to make. It is ours.
Hear, hear. Yeah, wow. I'm so delighted how aligned we are, and to hear you articulate your arguments so clearly. I do want to go back to this idea of genetic identity just for a moment. You do only touch upon it briefly in the chapter on this question of direct-to-consumer genetic testing. But it was one of the sections I found to be one of the most fascinating, and I thought perhaps a little bit, possibly the most important. But just to focus it a little bit, I'm sure you know these companies, MyHeritage, which I have used in the past, much to my dismay now, 23andMe, they're all kinds of them. I'm sure you know that they are a little bit controversial. I'm wondering, do you have a view on how reliable or valid the results that they provide are? And those results obviously are based on data sets and databases that they're using. I appreciate your argument that all of these fields are fields of political contestation, not scientific contestation. But do you have any commentary if we want to engage this question of genetic identity on its own terms? Do you have any thoughts on the scientific validity of this approach?
Well, let me respond on two levels, the scientific and the political, because that's exactly where a lot of public confusion comes from. At first, at the level of science, these companies are performing genuine genetic analysis. They are analyzing genetic markers, comparing your DNA against reference populations in their databases, and producing results that reflect patterns of human ancestry. The underlying genomic science is legitimate. In that sense, the results are not fake. They're comparing your DNA against databases. Now, the reliability of what they tell you depends on the quality and composition of those databases. When someone receives a report saying that they are, say, 15% Scandinavian or 2% Indigenous American, that is not a direct reading of identity written into their genes. It's a probabilistic estimate based on comparisons with reference populations. And there's a problem here. These databases are heavily skewed toward people of European descent because those are the populations that have historically participated in genetic research in the largest numbers. If your ancestry is European, the reference population is reasonably robust. But many African groups, most indigenous peoples of the Americas, as well as many communities across Asia and the Pacific, are underrepresented. So if your ancestry is from one of these populations, the reference data is much, much thinner, and the comparisons are less precise, and the results much less reliable. There's also a meaningful difference between what these tests can tell you about deep population ancestry, in other words, where your genetic lineages trace back over thousands of years, on the one hand, and on the other hand, what they can tell you about recent family history or your specific cultural identity. In marketing, these are often conflated, but scientifically, they're very different things. Human populations have always migrated across the earth, and they've always mixed their genes. So genetic boundaries rarely line up neatly with cultural or political identities. This brings me to the political level, a level of great consequence. The problem with direct consumer genetic testing companies, especially from the perspective of indigenous communities, is not primarily that they're scientifically unreliable, although that's certainly a concern. The deeper problem is what people do with the results. When someone receives a report showing a certain percentage of, say, Native American ancestry, and then uses that result to claim an indigenous identity, to assert belonging to a community, to access benefits, to present themselves publicly as indigenous, they have made a leap from a probabilistic statistical comparison to a claim about cultural and political membership. Yet that leap is not scientifically warranted. It is not culturally legitimate. It is not theirs to make. These platforms present the results with an air of scientific authority, with clean percentages and colorful pie charts that can feel more definitive than they actually are. The number on the screen looks like a fact, and in fact, it's merely an estimate produced by comparing your markers against a reference database that may have very limited coverage of the very population being named. And that number is interpreted then through proprietary algorithms that vary between companies. Think about this. People have sent the same sample to multiple companies and received notably different results. That alone should give pause. To be sure, these services can be genuinely interesting tools for exploring broad population ancestry, and for some people they offer real value, maybe by connecting with relatives or understanding migration patterns or filling in gaps in family history. But they are being marketed with a degree of confidence that outstrips what the science can actually deliver, particularly for non-European populations. And when the results get applied to questions of indigenous identity and community membership, these companies are using their tools for something these tools were never built to do. and they are being used for a purpose that most Indigenous communities have clearly said they do not recognize as legitimate.
Fantastic. As we head towards the end of our conversation, I wanted to see if we could focus a little bit less on the world that we do not want and maybe a little bit more on the world that we do, and specifically on the incentives for us all to get to those pristine shores. So, in a better world of Indigenous communities and genetic scientists collaborating together under a plural epistemological research framework, how would Indigenous communities benefit from such an arrangement, and how would broader humanity benefit?
Let me start with the benefits to Indigenous communities, because in my framework, those benefits are not a secondary bonus. They are the primary justification for the collaboration. The research must be oriented first and foremost toward Indigenous-defined health needs. Any broader benefits to humanity are certainly real and certainly welcome, but they flow from getting the primary relationship right, not the other way around. So what does getting the primary relationship right look like concretely? First, it means health research that is actually useful to the communities being studied. Indigenous populations often face specific disease burdens, elevated risks for conditions that are not well understood, precisely because these populations have been excluded from or exploited by mainstream research. Ethically conducted genomic research can identify genetic susceptibilities specific to particular communities. It can enable precision medicine, interventions tailored to the actual health profiles of real people, rather than interventions designed for the dominant population that have historically dominated clinical data sets. Second, the research capacity itself becomes an asset that remains within the community when collaboration is genuine, when Indigenous researchers are trained, and when community members are involved at every stage, from question setting to publication. Something is built that persists after any single study ends. Going forward, communities develop the tools, the expertise, and the institutional authority to conduct research on their own terms. Third, ethical research that takes structural causes seriously, that doesn't just look at genetic markers, but situates them within the history of colonization, displacement, poverty, and environmental degradation. That ethical research produces findings that are more accurate, precisely because those findings account for structural context. Indigenous co-leadership tends to ensure that research doesn't inadvertently suggest that health disparities are biologically inevitable. They are contingent, socially and historically. But here's the thing, getting this right for Indigenous communities turns out to be good for everyone else too. The first and most obvious benefit is that current global genomic databases are heavily skewed toward populations of European descent. And that means our collective scientific understanding of human genetic diversity, of disease susceptibility, of drug response, and of evolutionary history is built on a deeply incomplete picture of the human species. Including Indigenous populations would significantly improve the accuracy and breadth of that knowledge for everyone. Medicines work differently across genetic backgrounds. Disease risk varies across populations. Treatments developed without diverse genomic data are treatments that work less well for large portions of humanity. My chapter considers research on Indigenous Brazilian communities during the COVID-19 pandemic that found unusually low frequencies of genetic variants associated with severe outcomes. This finding has potential implications not just for those communities, but for a global understanding of COVID-19 pathology, as well as for the development of treatments and preventative strategies. But that finding was only possible because researchers engaged ethically with those Indigenous communities. It would never exist in a world of extracted research because those Indigenous communities would have had good reason and every right to refuse participation. More broadly, Many indigenous knowledge systems carry accumulated wisdom about ecological relationships, about sustainable land management, about medicinal plants, about the long-term dynamics of specific environments. This is practical insight developed over thousands of years of careful observation and practice. In the context of climate change and biodiversity loss, such insight may well turn out to be among the most useful resources for the planet. So the incentive structure here is not difficult to see. Indigenous communities would gain health research that serves their needs, a research capacity they would own, and a relationship with science that would affirm rather than threaten their sovereignty. Scientists would gain access to genetic diversity they currently lack. They would obtain richer and more contextually accurate findings, and they would gain the community trust without which so much research is impossible. And the rest of humanity benefits from a more complete science of human health and of human diversity and a more accurate science.
Yes, definitely. On that last piece, on the benefit for broader humanity, in another part of the chapter, you write about indigenous medicine, and it sounded so much like what we would call today patient-centered care or patient-centered medicine. You even say yourself explicitly at one point, you write, quote, "The indigenous model of holistic wellness focuses on environmental factors that, to an extent, can complement symptom-focused scientific medicine by informing more patient-centered approaches to health," end quote. I mean, it sounds a lot like science as we understand it, at least in terms of Western medicine, would also be much better off, and therefore all of humanity better off, by applying what you characterize as more indigenous approaches.
You've touched on something that I find genuinely exciting, but I want to be careful not to overstate it because the details really matter here. I'll begin with what I think is exactly right about the observation. Western biomedicine, as it developed through the 19th and 20th centuries, became increasingly reductionistic in its approach. It got extraordinarily good at isolating specific mechanisms, identifying a pathogen, targeting a tumor, correcting a chemical imbalance. And that reductionist power has produced genuine miracles. But the same reductionist logic taken too far produces blind spots. It tends to generate a model of healthcare in which the patient is essentially a collection of symptoms to be treated, abstracted from the life they actually live, their relationships, their environment, their sense of meaning, their community, the stresses produced by poverty or displacement. Indigenous healing traditions, across their enormous diversity, tend to start from the opposite direction. Health is not the absence of a diagnosable condition. It is a state of balance, balance of the individual and their community, balance of the person and the land, balance of the physical, mental, and spiritual dimensions of a person's life. When someone is unwell, the question is not only what is wrong with his body, the question is also what is out of balance in this person's relationship with the world around them. What Western medicine has been slowly rediscovering through social determinants of health research and through evidence accumulating around loneliness and chronic stress as drivers of disease is that indigenous framing was pointing at something real all along. The idea that your health is inseparable from your relationships, from your environment, and from your sense of meaning is not mysticism. It is increasingly supported empirically. So yes, Western medicine would be better, and patients everywhere would be better served by incorporating more of what I call the holistic orientation that characterizes some indigenous approaches to wellness. Not by abandoning clinical trials, not by dismissing pharmacology, but by treating those tools as operating with a broader understanding of what health is. But here's where I want to be precise, because this is where a division of labor framework matters most. I'm arguing that indigenous ways of understanding health can inform how biomedical science is practiced. Those indigenous ways can shape the questions researchers ask, the outcomes they measure, the relationships between clinician and patient. That is a genuine contribution. What I am not arguing is that specific indigenous therapeutic practices, herbal treatments, ceremonial healing, spiritual interventions, should be treated as clinically equivalent to interventions that have been subjected to rigorous empirical testing. Those are very different claims, and conflating them does a disservice to both traditions. This is a difference that makes a difference because the stakes are high. A patient with a treatable infection who foregoes antibiotics in favor of traditional ceremony alone is in real danger. The ceremony may be profoundly meaningful and may support healing in ways that clinical medicine cannot, but the antibiotic is doing something specific that nothing else does. The goal here is not to choose between these. It is to understand that each contributes and to create care environments where both can operate without treading on the other. What makes this more than theoretical is that we already have evidence that it works. The Maori cardiovascular study in New Zealand, to mention it one last time, is relevant here. The researchers built their engagement around Maori concepts of relationship, hospitality, and communal discussion. The result was not just better data collection. The result was better care. Care that was more trusted, more meaningful to participants, more likely to actually change health behaviors. The science was not diluted by this cultural attunement. It was improved by it. In this model, one system is not replaced by the other. The model expands what we are willing to count as relevant to health, and it expands who gets to be heard when we make decisions about health.
Fantastic. Dr. Gregg, this has been such a pleasure. I really, really enjoyed exploring this topic with you today. Thank you so much for this lovely conversation.
Thank you so much by honoring me with your invitation, and I really enjoyed your questions. Thank you.
It's been a real joy to listen to you. That was Dr. Benjamin Gregg, and this has been another episode of Sustainability Matters. Don't forget, you can also participate in the podcast. Let us know what you think of Sustainability Matters. If you would like us to cover any particular topics in future episodes, or if you have thoughts on Indigenous justice in genetic research that you would like us to explore, do write to us and let us know. Our email, as always, is podcast@brill.com. We would love to hear from you. And if enough of you write to us about scientific ethics or any other topic related to sustainability in scholarly publishing and beyond, we promise to explore it in future episodes. Thank you as always for being with us. I'm your host, Ramsey Nasser. See you again next month.
You are listening to Sustainability Matters by Gruyter Brill.